Hi, this is Professor Thomas White again. This is the third bit of video, and this is the last piece of my combination of an apology and warning to your generation. So let's get down to it. Okay, slideshow. Okay, an apology and a warning, part 2. Now remember the apology, which was the other video that I did, said that my generation and your parents' generation owe you an apology for having allowed it to happen over the last 50 years, that the United States is characterized by levels of ignorance that are truly dangerous, both in terms of science, the Constitution, global warming, and that's detailed in the other video, but we really are talking about it. One of the reasons that the situation that we have right now with COVID-19 is so bad and the response has been so poor is that the population is just massively ignorant of too many things and has allowed a situation to happen which is threatening, both not only now for the present, but more importantly for you in the future. So the point of this video is the second part, that is the warning, and that is that you are going to be told that your generation must sacrifice because the country will not be able to afford to deal with global warming, rebuild our infrastructure, provide for Social Security, our Medicare as it has been. Now you're going to be hearing calls for austerity and fiscal responsibility, and that all of this is required because of the national deficit. And various people are going to do hand-wringing and talk about how irresponsible we've been as a nation, and that sadly you're going to have to pay for that because, and this is where, as I said in the last video, this logical mistake of the false dilemma is going to be offered, because people are going to tell you we either have to fix the deficit and fix the budget or there's going to be disaster. So this is what you're going to be told. Now, none of this is true. You are being set up. People are going to try to gaslight you on this. You just need to understand the situation and for your generation to take appropriate action. The point of this video is to give you some sense of what's going on and at least one thought about what you might be able to do. So let's start with some very basic stuff about the American economy. Okay, so here we have a graph of the gross domestic product, which is the main marker of economic productivity from end of the Second World War through, this is probably like 2016 or so. Notice that this is all upward, except for the gray areas of recessions. We had a big dip here with the Wall Street meltdown. But generally speaking, this is good news. This is a strong, consistently strong economy for more than 50, 60 years. If we look specifically at how corporations have done, same thing. Go back to post-World War II all the way through, again, except for the crash. Corporations have really been making record amounts of money. So that's definitely good news from that standpoint. When we turn our attention to the U.S. budget, however, we get sort of a mixed picture. So if we start with back after the Second World War, you'll notice, okay, so the red is what we're taking in, the blue is what we're spending. We've been pretty good up until right around here, where the budgets, what we spend, what we take in has been, relatively close. From then we start getting, though, with the exception of this, which was when Bill Clinton was president, we get the expenditures really being significantly out by the not keeping up with the receipts not keeping up with expenditures. And this is then what causes the national debt, because we then borrow against that. And you'll see that the red line, the amount of money that the government takes in, has been consistently lower than what we've been spending. Now, some people will immediately say, oh, that means we're spending too much. Other people will say, well, no, we've been taking in too little. But there's this big gap, and that's part of what you're going to have to decide, which is the right answer on that score. Now, as I said, we have been spending more than we've been taking in, and so if you go back to in the 1960s, this is the total federal debt, what people talk about as the deficit, and it's now about $24 trillion. And as you see, it's really gone up sharply in the last 20 years, certainly in the last 10. This is all after the Wall Street crash, and we see this is now going up. If you look at this historically over time, go back to the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II. World War II, obviously we had to spend like crazy to fight the war, but then that came down. We are at and heading towards absolutely historic levels of federal debt. So how serious that is, this issue, the question of percentage of GDP is one of the things economists will argue about at what point it starts getting unhealthy. But nonetheless, as you can see, we aren't fighting a war, but we do have massive amounts of projected national debt. Well, as I said, it's either we're spending too much or not enough taking in, or both. So what do we see? If we look at sources of federal revenue since 1950, you'll see that the trend has certainly been that the amount of money that's been coming in from the corporate income tax has definitely decreased. The percentage of individual income tax has been roughly stable, although what's called the payroll tax, that amount has grown considerably. Strictly speaking, this is split between an employer and an employee. Many people argue that the way this is often done is that the employee ends up paying more of this than half. But so this has been stable, this has gone up, but this has definitely gone down, despite the fact that we have really healthy corporate growth and corporate profits. As you see, corporate income tax is now down to 9%, where it had been probably around 30 before. Now, one of the reasons that the budget outlet, the expenditures versus receipts was not supposed to be the way it is that we've always been told with each tax cut that tax cuts will pay for themselves, and that there's no problem with generating wealth in the country, that generating wealth is good because it will trickle down. So this is the argument you get anytime there's a tax cut proposed for corporations and the wealthy, that as you get the wealth at the top, that will be invested to create jobs. That will increase demand. Lower skilled workers will get higher pay. There will then be increased tax revenues and increased spending. So tax cuts pay for themselves because you give the money to the rich, they'll invest it, it will develop into salaries, jobs, profits that will produce tax revenues, and so tax cuts pay for themselves. You'll also get social good, where more jobs, higher quality of living, and the like. That's the way it's supposed to work from that theory. It doesn't. So if we take a look at each of let's see what tax cuts really do. So here are the most, over the last 40 years, 2 tax cuts for Ronald Reagan, the Bush tax cut 2001 to 2003, and the Trump 2017 tax cuts. So Reagan, Bush, Trump. Notice what happens. What's been going on, the wealth has not been trickling down. This is the 95th percentile people, the top 5%. Notice they keep getting an increased share of the income gains in income, whereas everyone else is pretty much stable. So any benefits that have gone here are not trickling down into income for people in the rest of the economy. Wealth, which is different than income, same deal. Since 1962, and certainly accelerating more here, wealth has gone to the top. The top 1% has done extremely well. The bottom 90% has lost. So what we've seen is actually a transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So the share of American wealth owned by the top 1% versus the top 90% here, as we see, if all US wealth is thought of as 100 slices of the pie, the wealthiest 1/5 of households would have 90, which then leaves only 10 for, you know, the rest of us, the other 80%. So that's where the money went. It did not trickle down, it trickled up. And a graphic on this, so that the wealth in the United States, the total wealth is about $98 trillion. The top 1% of the population holds 25 trillion. The top 20% holds about 80 trillion. As you can see, the bottom 20%, middle class, a whole lot less. So again, this is where the money went from the tax cuts. It did not trickle down. Now, at the same time, you have to keep in mind that, and again, this is the argument that, well, you know, jobs were produced, and even so, you know, wealth did trickle down to some extent. This is about the compensation, so wages and salary in relation to gross domestic product. Since so we have a high water mark here of 1970. Since 1970, it has done nothing but go down. Had another kind of increase around here, but generally speaking, the amount of money in the economy, in the GDP, that goes to wages and salary has gone down. So once again, there's no trickling down going on here. Not only that, people are ultimately worse off as far as comparison, you know, percentage to, in relationship to the GDP. Student debt, which you are all too familiar with, if you go back to early 2000, it's done nothing but climb, and we're at the point where total student debt in the United States is now about $1.6 trillion. So we have total wealth in the United States of 98 trillion, national debt of 24 trillion, increasing national debt, and also massive concentrations of wealth. So if anyone had said, well, gee, the way supply side economics, the way trickle down theory works, tax cuts for the rich, this isn't supposed to work out this way. Even if you have increased concentration of wealth, it's supposed to work so that you don't end up with a massive national debt. You're supposed to be taking in greater tax revenue. Now, this is what you're going to hear. So this is the transcript of an interview between a CBS News person and in 2012 and Lloyd Blankfein, who at the time was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who's now worth $1 billion. The question was how to avoid fiscal disaster given the national debt. And Blankfein says this: you're going to have to undoubtedly do something to lower people's expectations, the entitlements, and what people think that they're going to get, because they're not going to get it. Interviewer: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Blankfein: some things. And you know, you can go back and you can look at the history of these things, and Social Security wasn't devised to be a system that supported you for a 30-year retirement after a 25-year career. Entitlements have to be slowed down and contained. Interviewer: because we can't afford them going forward? Because we can't afford them. Okay, that's what you're going to, this was 2012, so people were already starting on this a few years ago, and this is what you're going to hear more of, that because of the trillions of dollars that had to be spent for COVID-19, because it was already on top of a historically large national debt, we cannot afford for your generation to get what other generations have gotten. So the argument is just, look, the money is not there, we're in debt, we have to be fiscally responsible, and so we have to have programs of austerity. So these are things that will go by the board. Repairing infrastructure, which we've let go. So the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the nation's infrastructure a grade of D+ for 2017. They figure that out every 4 years. They say it will take $588 billion for roads, bridges, and dams. So we're going to be told, well, no, unless one collapses, we can't spend on that. Cost of climate change, that's cost $350 billion in the last decade. By 2050, the figure will be $35 billion a year. And that we're talking about, cleanup, disaster assistance, and the like, which is all going to happen under rising temperatures. So those are also something that we're told, no, you're going to be told, no, we can't really do anything about that. We can't afford it. The money's not there. And this, by the way, is already happening. So these are stories from just this month. GOP rekindles deficit concerns, adding snag to talks. Someone else writing, oh, the national debt is out of control. Senator Rick Scott said, we've got to figure out now how we're going to pay for it. Otherwise, we're going to ruin this economy. Okay, so that's what you're going to you're going to hear. You're starting this now. It's going to get worse once things settle down. It's going to be your generation has to pay for the fact that your parents' generation and my generation have been fiscally irresponsible. They will say we spent like crazy and didn't worry about revenue, and that you then are going to have to sacrifice. Now, that's not true. There's plenty of money there, which we'll take a look at in a minute. So, in their ideology, you just never touch money that goes to the rich, no matter whether they deserved it or not, and that's wealth is a good thing. And if you have fiscal irresponsibility, if you aren't taking in enough money for the government, that means you shouldn't be running certain programs. Look, if any business was doing that, they'd immediately increase the cost of their product, their goods or services to cover that. No business would run that way. But we've run the government that way. We have not been collecting the taxes that we should have from the people who had most of the money. So here's what I propose. As I said, your generation is going to have to deal with this. You have to resist the argument that we just don't have the money. The money is not there, and we can't afford, because of the national debt, we can't afford for there to be social programs or infrastructure, Social Security, universal health care, and the like. So here's what I propose as one way that you might think about this. Consider this a thought experiment. We say that the major tax cuts, going back to 1980, were really experiments testing the claim that tax cuts will pay for themselves. Every time those tax cuts were proposed, the argument was, well, they'll pay for themselves. They'll generate enough revenue. It will cover the tax cuts. Okay, what we know is that that money got directed to the wealthy and to corporations. We can now say that, well, look, they didn't use the money in a way that did pay for themselves, that pay for the tax cuts. The money didn't get invested in jobs and other parts of and other things in the economy that generated tax revenue that then paid for the tax cut. So we say, okay, this is what you said. Tax cuts will pay for themselves. We say, okay, let's try that. We tried it. Okay, didn't work. Didn't work because the tax side of it wasn't handled properly. So now we say, okay, because what happened during that time when we were doing that experiment, the deficit got out of control. So now what we need is for those people to return that money to pay off the deficit. So here we have the federal budget. Notice that in this, when we had these tax cuts, what was happening was we just weren't collecting enough money. The deficit went up. It went up at historic levels. At the same time, though, corporations were doing extremely well, and they were being asked to pay a smaller portion. Wealth individually, income and wealth got transferred to the top during that period of time. So it's not unreasonable to say, look, one way to deal with the deficit is to reverse the direction of the transfer of wealth. We now have a $24 trillion national debt because the money went to a small part of the population. It went to the top 1%, the top 20%. And look, the deficit is 24 trillion. Top 20% of the country holds $80 trillion. That number would not have been that high. The 25 trillion of the top 1% would have not been that high if we had tax policies that kept this at a lower level. So as I'm suggesting, one of the ways to think about this is, look, do this as a thought experiment. If we knew in 1980 the tax cuts wouldn't pay for themselves, we wouldn't have done that. So we tried, it didn't work. We now say, okay, the money has to come back. Now, this is then the warning that I'm giving you. Okay, you're going to be told that you have to sacrifice because the country won't be able to afford dealing with global warming, infrastructure, Social Security, Medicare, and the like. You're going to hear calls for you have to sacrifice. You're going to hear calls for austerity and fiscal responsibility. None of that's true, but you're going to have to take appropriate action. You're going to have to understand the situation. This is what your generation can do to protect itself. First of all, you have to understand the problem. You have been, you and your parents and everyone else has been sold a bill of goods about how the economy works. It does not work. There is no empirical evidence that suggests that tax cuts pay for themselves. There is no empirical evidence that suggests that wealth trickles down. It just doesn't do that. So you have to understand the problem. You have to, now this has been, this has been government policy. So that means you have to have a political solution to this. That means you have to organize, and most importantly, you have to vote. Now, it is one of the unfortunate features of American life that people of college age tend not to vote. You may be very active politically in some ways, but you don't seem, we don't seem to make it to the polls until later in life. And that means that your generation, people in their 20s, early 30s, typically are not as well represented. Their interests are not well represented in the government. You can change that. You have to remember that the last time, at least in my lifetime, the last time that a college generation was politically active was at the time of the Vietnam War, when, campus protests and all basically led to that war winding down. By the way, that also is the reason that we now have an all-volunteer army, because it was clear that the reason that people were getting worked up about, was the Vietnam War legitimate or not, was because that was where people were going to get drafted out of. As soon as there was a volunteer army, campus, politics on campus got to be a different kind of thing. It is possible, though, if you organize, if you vote, you can make a substantial difference in national policy. And if you're going to protect yourself, you're going to have to do that. Because, as I said, you are going to be told you have to sacrifice. You're going to be told the money is not there. That's not true. The money is there. It's just going to have to be transferred from one part of the economy back to the other part of the economy. It never would have gotten there in the first place if people had understood that the idea that tax cuts pay for themselves and that wealth trickles down just were not true. So I certainly wish you well. I hope that you've had a chance to watch, the three videos I've done. As I said, your generation is owed an apology and a warning. And I certainly hope that this helps. This is not going to be easy, but as I'm sure you're told all the time in commencement addresses and the like, the world really can be the way that you shape it. But it's going to take more than unusual amount of focus and action on the part of your generation. But it can be done, and I hope this is at least a small help in that direction. Good luck.